So why can't ULTY's NAV go up? I was DMing with one of my option trading friends in Discord this morning, and I thought you guys might also be interested in what we were discussing. By the way, my name's Max. My channel's name is The Covered Caller. On X, you can find me at Max Convexity Man. Now remember to check anything I say with the license planner. I have a great video planned tonight. We're going to look at the two main factors that determine about 90% of what a NAV does in any high yield ETF. There's a few more factors, but if you just understand these two main concepts that I'm teaching tonight, you'll understand why ULTY's NAV doesn't usually go up. Even if you don't like ULTY, these concepts apply to any high yield ETF. In fact, we're also going to look at JEPI, which is a fund I know a lot of folks like. My friend and I were talking about what it takes for these high yield ETFs to have NAV growth or to have flat NAV. Our conversation reminded me of one of my high yield rules of thumb, and I haven't made a video about this in a while. The rule of thumb is for any high yield ETF, I don't care what it is. It even applies to SPY, T-SPY. Any high yield ETF needs the underlying assets in the portfolio that it sells options on to appreciate at least as much as whatever the yield is that that fund pays. Realistically, they really need the assets to be up a little bit more than what the yield is. We'll get into that in a second. For instance, if you have a fund that pays a 20% yield, but the assets it tracks are only up 10% in that year, that fund will have poor NAV performance. In fact, that fund will likely have negative NAV performance. But don't forget how a dividend is paid and where it comes from. The dividend's paid out of the NAV. This is the cause of NAV depletion. Here's another rule of thumb for you. If you're ultra concerned about NAV performance, just choose ETFs that have a low yield. Why do you think JEPI from JP Morgan has a steady NAV? To understand this, you have to understand what goes into creating a steady NAV. JEPI's NAV appears to be rock solid because the yield's only 8%. JEPI's underlines only have to be up at least 8% plus a little bit for the NAV to have a chance of growth. Remember, JEPI's underline is the SPY, and the SPY can easily go up 10, 12, 15% in a year, no problem. In 2024, in fact, the SPY was up about twice as much as that, and sure enough, JEPI had good NAV growth in 2024. Regular Max viewers who watch my live streams will hear me say at least 3 times a day, high distribution's great, but a high distribution is like a tax on the future NAV growth of that high yield ETF. This applies to any ETF. Like I say, even SPY, KQQQ, GPIQ, GPIX. Yes, those are all great funds. I'm not saying anything bad about any of those ETFs, but this concept of a tax on the NAV's future upside applies to them just like it applies to ULTY and MISTI. This goes back to something else I'll remind my viewers of, and that is there's no such thing as free money. There's no reward without risk. It's just a fact of life in investing. Think of it this way. Buying something like JEPI instead of something like ULTY is like living in Texas versus California. Say you earn $100,000. Can you live comfortably in San Diego? Well, not really after you pay that huge state tax bill that California gives you. You don't have that much left over to live off of. Can you live comfortably on $100,000 in West Austin, Texas? West Austin's roughly as expensive as San Diego, believe it or not. You can possibly live all right in West Austin on the $100,000 because you have a little bit more left over. Remember, the Texas state tax is 0. There's a headwind to living in California, just like there's a headwind to investing in super high yield ETFs. Remember, everyone wants a high yield, but no one likes to see the asset prices decline. I get that. The good news is we can do something about it, and knowledge is power. So now let's talk about the two main drivers of ETF NAV performance. Number 1 is the amount of yield the ETF pays. Number 2 is what is in the underlying basket of stocks and how much are those stocks going up in the next year. You can't sell options on nothing. The options have to be sold on some type of asset. You have to sell them on a stock or an index or a basket of stocks. And that's the stocks and indexes and baskets of stocks, for that matter, go up and down with the market. Back to ULTY now. how does ULTY pay such a high yield? They write options on a basket of stocks, and the basket of stocks is much more volatile, even more volatile than the NASDAQ is. In fact, ULTY is more closely correlated with Bitcoin or the ETF HODL. Check out this chart of ULTY and HODL. It's very obvious they are highly correlated. You can see in July, they both made highs at the same time, then went sideways to down for a little while. Then Bitcoin and ULTY made a new high in September and October, and then since then have come crashing down. So let's work a few examples now. ULTY and HODL's 1 year chart. That's the first thing we're going to look at. I have it up on the screen now. Look at ULTY's NAV price. It's down from 10 to 4. That's 60% in a year. Now, HODL's NAV is down 14.95%. So why the heck would anyone invest in ULTY? Well, don't forget the dividend has to come out of somewhere, and it's coming out of the NAV price. That's part of the reason that the NAV is down 60%. But the dividend goes into your bank account, even if you don't reinvest it or drip it. These examples don't consider drip. ULTY has paid a $5.72 dividend, and it costs $10 in this example. So that's a 57% yield over this 1 year time frame we're looking at. Once you factor in the 57% dividend, you have an investment whose NAV went down 60%, but who returned a 57% dividend. So what's negative 60 plus 57? It's positive 3. And lo and behold, look at Ulty's total return on the year. It's negative 3. Look at ULTY's total return. It was negative 3. Now, HODL was down almost 11%. ULTY is not necessarily a bad investment over the past year. It has a better total return than Bitcoin and therefore HODL. Yes, it's true that ULTY's NAV is a bad investment, but the money doesn't disappear as soon as the dividend is paid unless you have a Coke habit. The money goes into your bank, or it goes to pay bills or buy other stocks or whatever it is that you do with it. You still have to count the dividend in your return stream. So what would it take for ULTY's NAV to go up or to be flat? All right, remember my rule of thumb. The underlying assets that ULTY sells options on need to be up more than whatever the yield is. This will offset the NAV depletion. It's just math. It's not magic. So let's look at a time when ULTY's NAV price went up or was flat and see what it took. Using my rule of thumb, ULTY's underlying basket, and I'm using HODL as a proxy for ULTY's underlines, would therefore need to be up at least what the yield was plus a little more. Is that a lot? Heck yes. That's why I say investing in these ultra high yield ETFs is like sailing into a headwind or living in California. But can it happen? Absolutely. So let's look at the 6 months from April 8th to October 8th. ULTY's NAV was up 14% or 14 cents in 6 months, which is 2.2%. On an annualized basis, that comes out to 4.4%. Now, what did HODL do? We're going to call 4.4 flat NAV, okay? Now, what did HODL do over the same time? HODL's NAV was up was up 60% or about 121% on an annualized basis. Also, we have to consider ULTY's dividend to figure this math out. ULTY paid $2.49 in this half a year period. Annualize that and ULTY would have paid $5. So you receive $5 on an asset that initially cost $5.42. $5 divided by $5.42 is 92.25. Ulty's dividend was 92.25, right? So Ulty's basket of underlying stocks needs to be up at least 92% plus a little for Ulty to have flat NAV. It is what Ulty must overcome. Think of it as ULTY's tax bracket or ULTY's headwind. So it took HODL being up 121% for ULTY to have positive NAV. Let's work the math on that. 121 divided by 92 is about 1.3. Just think of it this way. Anytime you buy a high yielder that pays 50%, can the underlying stocks in this basket go up at least 1.3 times the yield, 50%. 1.3 times 50% is 65. When you buy a 50% yielder, if you expect steady NAV, you're essentially betting that the underlying basket of stocks will be up 65% annually. If you buy a 100% yielder and you expect flat NAV, you're betting that the asset's price will be up 130% every year. Now, you don't have to have steady NAV to have good performance. The first example I showed you, ULTY beat Bitcoin for the past year on a total return basis, despite ULTY having NAV that was down 60%. It dropped from $10 to $4, and you still did better than Bitcoin. In this example, with ULTY and HODL for April through October, ULTY's total return is 48%, so we annualize that as 96%. HODL's NAV was 60% or 121% annualized. Why did you do better in HODL? Well, for one thing, because there's no such thing as free money. You get a little extra reward in the form of a dividend with ULTY, so you have a little bit of extra risk. And the extra risk is that covered call strategies almost always lag the underlying. Doesn't mean covered call strategies are a bad investment. Not if you need an income. Remember, if you don't need an income, you almost always do better in growth assets. This is exactly why I say these ETFs are not for creating generational wealth. Now, the high yield ETFs will create generational wealth for guys like Dave Mazza at Round Hill or Howard Chan at Curve, but the average retail investor would almost always do better just staying in growth assets. However, if you're retired, you don't have a job, you're living off your investments, high yield ETFs can be part of the solution, but so could bonds, so could real estate investment trust, or even closed-end funds. However, if you're young and you have a job, I say just let the paycheck from your job support your lifestyle and let your assets grow. Steady NAV is not the be-all and end-all, but if you expect a steady NAV, just know what you're asking the underlying basket of stocks to do. Know what you own. Remember, there's no such thing as free money, no reward without risk. It's just math. It's not magic. Let's go back to the JEPI example. JEPI from JP Morgan pays an 8 or 9% yield. The reason JEPI appears to have steady NAV is because you're only asking the underlying basket of stocks, which is the SPY, to be up 8 or 9%, which is the yield, times 1.3. Same with QQQI. QQQI is an awesome fund, but it doesn't work any different from ULTY or JEPI for that matter. Every ETF, even SCHD, pays a dividend out of the NAV. So let's look at this JEPI example. JEPI's NAV over the same 6 months we were just talking about with ULTY went up about 10% from 51 and change to 56 and change. So look at the basket of stocks that JEPI uses. It's represented by the SPY. In this same period of time, the SPY was up about 30%. JEPI was up about 10% on NAV. To have flat NAV, I think that the SPY would have to be up about 15%. And 15% is 9% times 1.5. So that would make sense. Are these the only two factors that go into high yield NAV performance? Of course not. But I would say these two factors make up about 90% of what determines high yield performance. It also matters if the managers sell weekly, daily, or monthly options. It also manages how far out of the money they put the options. It also matters if they sell calls or call spreads or lightning spreads. But those are minor compared to these two factors. If you understand these two factors, that will explain 90% of the NAV return. We could figure out what it would take for ULTY's NAV to double. It's just math. We could also figure out how soon ULTY might have to split again using the same math we learned tonight. But that's the subject for part 2. Tune in tomorrow night and we'll have part 2. Remember, if you don't want NAV depletion, just choose an ETF with a lower yield, or choose an ETF whose underlying assets will be up at least 1.3 times as much as the yield on that ETF. If an ETF pays 20% and say it's based on the SPY like XPay or SPY-T, and you expect flat NAV performance, you're asking the SPY to be up about 26%, which is 20%, the yield, times 1.3. Remember, flat NAV isn't everything. Some ETFs are in a constant state of NAV decline and still have decent total return. If you don't want NAV issues, just buy ETFs that yield as little as possible. Maybe don't buy high yield ETFs at all. Remember, bonds, REITs, and even rental property can also provide a retirement income. Covered calls aren't the only show in town. It's your money. You worked hard to earn it. You get to decide how to spend it, how to invest it. Only you and your financial planner know what level of risk is acceptable for your situation. Remember, I'm not a financial planner. Please check anything you hear with a licensed planner. If you like this type of content and you want to give me a tip, please go to paypal.me/maxconvexity. I'd really appreciate it. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. From Austin with love, Max out.